For decades, when the United States sanctions someone, the world usually obeys. Countries may protest loudly, issue diplomatic complaints, or accuse Washington of abusing its power, but in the end, most companies, banks, and institutions still quietly comply. China was no exception. Even when Beijing strongly opposed certain US sanctions, many Chinese companies and financial institutions still ended up following them. There's actually a very famous and almost absurd example of this. Back in 2020, the United States sanctioned Hong Kong chief executive Carrie Lam. Under normal logic, you would think, okay, maybe American institutions comply, but surely banks inside Hong Kong and China would still provide normal services to their own chief executive, right? But that's not what happened. Even local banks, including some Chinese state-owned banks, became extremely cautious. Carrie Lam later publicly revealed that she had to receive her salary in cash because banks were unwilling to handle her accounts normally. Why? Because these banks feared secondary sanctions and losing access to dollar clearing channels. But this time, something different happened. Just a few weeks ago, the United States sanctioned 5 Chinese oil refiners accused of purchasing Iranian oil. Well, normally, China would issue strong protests, condemn the sanctions, and then quietly absorb the pressure underneath. But this time, Beijing escalated its response to an entirely different level. For the first time in history, China formally moved from diplomatic protest to actual legal counteraction. Not just words, not just condemnation. China officially told companies inside China, including in Hong Kong, you are not allowed to comply with these US sanctions anymore. That may sound technical, but it's actually a very serious move. Because once this becomes law instead of rhetoric, the entire situation changes. Suddenly, multinational companies are no longer dealing with just American pressure. They are caught between 2 competing legal systems. The US says, if you continue dealing with sanctioned entities, you may lose access to the American financial system, like SWIFT. China now says, if you comply with certain US sanctions while cooperating in China, you may violate Chinese law. And honestly, nobody fully knows how far this could escalate if both sides continue pushing. I think China understands that too, but at the same time, Beijing also seems to believe it can no longer remain at the stage of simply strongly protesting while quietly accepting the actual consequences underneath. And interestingly, at least for now, the United States itself does not seem eager to let this spiral completely out of control either. Because despite all the tough rhetoric, Washington still clearly wants to preserve the broader relationship. Trump is literally preparing to fly to Beijing with a delegation of American CEOs, while sanctions are simultaneously being announced. Just imagine sanctioning a country on Friday and flying there with business delegations on Monday. That image alone tells you how strange and complicated the current US-China relationship has become. Chinese central government has probably been waiting and preparing for this moment for a very long time. Over the past several years, Beijing has been quietly building alternative settlements mechanisms, increasing cross-border RMB usage, expanding bilateral currency swap agreements, and continuously increasing gold reserves. Yes, China has clearly been strengthening its gold position as part of a broader long-term financial strategy. But despite all this progress, there is still one huge obstacle preventing the RMB from truly competing with the dollar at a global level: liquidity and convertibility. People can move US dollars in and out relatively freely. Global investors trust that liquidity, but the RMB still does not fully offer that. China maintains significant capital controls because policymakers prioritize financial stability and control. Full convertibility and unrestricted capital flows could expose China to enormous speculative attacks and financial volatility. But at the same time, without greater freedom of movement for capital, it becomes very difficult for the RMB to become a true global reserve currency capable of genuinely challenging the dollar system. That's why I don't think China is trying to replace the dollar system overnight. What China is really trying to do now is something much more cautious and gradual. Slowly reduce absolute dependence on the dollar-centered system. We won't be witnessing the end of dollar. What we are seeing instead is something more subtle, but probably more important, the beginning of a world where countries, companies, and the financial systems slowly preparing for multiple parallel structures instead of one fully dominant system. And from my own perspective, doing business in China, I can already feel the atmosphere changing. More lawyers, more compliance reviews, more payments, sensitivity, more geopolitical calculations, entering decisions that used to be purely commercial. 10 years ago, supply chains were built mainly for efficiency. Today, they are increasingly built for resilience and political survivability.